Why did the funny guy suddenly stop laughing? Nick was always the funny one at work. He'd joke around, make everyone laugh, never seemed stressed about anything. Then all of a sudden, he stopped. He started coming in looking tired, like he hadn't slept in days. And after a week of seeing him like that, I finally asked what was going on. He slumped against the break room wall and said, "My neighbors are making my life hell." I thought he was exaggerating until he went on. "They bang on the walls all night, stomp around at 3 in the morning, scream at each other till sunrise." I was sitting there eating my granola bar, getting genuinely pissed off for him. "Dude, that's insane. You can't even sleep?" He shook his head. "Haven't slept right in weeks." He pulled out his phone and showed me a recording he'd made, but the audio quality was terrible, and I could barely make out anything beyond some static and muffled sounds. I told him I knew how frustrating that was when you're running on no sleep, but he should definitely call his landlord about this harassment. The others rolled their eyes whenever Nick mentioned his neighbors, saying he was being dramatic, but I kept encouraging him to document everything and maybe even get the police involved. Nick seemed so relieved that someone was finally taking him seriously, and he said it felt good to vent to someone who actually listened instead of dismissing him like everyone else did. But about a week later, Nick came in looking completely wrecked. His shirt was half untucked, his eyes half shut, and his hands shook so badly he almost dropped a case of water. He pulled me aside near the dairy cooler and told me things had gotten so much worse because now the neighbors were following him around, showing up wherever he went. They'd followed him to his car after work yesterday, and he'd seen them drive past his parents' house when he was visiting. I was getting seriously worried and told him this was stalking and he needed to file a police report immediately. He let out this exhausted laugh and said he'd called the cops 3 times already, but nothing ever happened because these people were smart about it, always leaving before police arrived, never doing anything they could prove. Nick looked toward the front windows and his whole body went stiff. He grabbed my arm and told me their car had been right there in the lot when he pulled up. He swore he saw it. I looked out, but it was gone by then. I told him I'd walk out with him after our shift to make sure everything was cool, but then I thought about it more and suggested maybe he should crash at his parents' place for a while until this blew over. He could get some actual sleep there, gather all his documentation, and then go down to the police station in person to file a restraining order or whatever he needed to do. Nick nodded and said it made sense. He'd been meaning to go to his parents, but kept putting it off. He thanked me for pushing him to finally do it. A few days later, our manager mentioned Nick had called in sick, and after a week of absences, word got around that he'd been let go for missing too many shifts, which made me feel sick because I kept thinking my advice had somehow made things worse. After about a month of radio silence, Nick walked back into the store one morning like nothing had happened, though he looked healthier and had clearly been sleeping better. I caught up with him in the stockroom and asked if he'd finally gotten those psycho neighbors evicted or if he'd moved somewhere else to escape them. He gave me this long, uncomfortable look before saying something like, "Yeah, something like that," in a way that made it clear he didn't want to talk about specifics. He mentioned he'd been in the hospital for a while and had to sort some things out, which made my chest tighten because those assholes had literally harassed him to the point of needing medical help. I told him it was complete bullshit that the store had fired him while he was dealing with all that, but he just shrugged and said he was grateful they'd hired him back at all. Later that afternoon, one of the guys who'd worked at the store longer than me pulled me aside in the break room with this weird expression on his face and asked if I'd heard what actually happened with Nick's neighbors. That's when he told me the truth that made my stomach drop. Nick's apartment was at the very end of his building's hallway, with a brick wall on one side and only one neighboring unit on the other side. The property manager had confirmed that the neighboring apartment had been completely vacant for 8 months before Nick even moved into the building, with no tenants, no furniture, and definitely no one living there to bang on walls or follow him around. All those times Nick called the police and they couldn't do anything. It was because there was literally nothing they could do since no one was there. Nick had been experiencing undiagnosed schizophrenia. He'd gone to his parents that night like I suggested, and when they found him pacing and yelling at people who weren't there, they took him to the hospital. He's doing much better now with proper treatment and medication, and he recently mentioned that someone finally moved in next door and they're super quiet and friendly. I just really hope they actually exist this time.